So I just wanted to do a video to kind of lay out my political beliefs and my worldview, just so we can kind of know, you can kind of know where I'm coming from, because that's very important to me. It's kind of one of the things I've always promised you, my audience, is to be real with you. That doesn't mean sharing everything, but it means that when you come and you watch me, you're getting who I am as a person and what I actually believe. Obviously, if I'm joking, I'm doing satire, I'm exaggerating for comedic of a dramatic effect, that's different. But I try really hard to do what you see is what you get. So I think it's important for me to just kind of lay this out so that you know where I'm coming from. And it's very important to me personally that if people like me or hate me, it's on the basis of who I am and what I do, rather than a misconception. So if people just disagree with me and they want to say you're evil or whatever, that's okay. What bothers me is when I get comments and people don't understand where I'm coming from, or they misinterpret something I said, and that's kind of the issue. But that being said, I think it's important to lay your cards out there, to not kind of be ambiguous and to kind of jump back and forth between different ideologies and positions. And I think it's important to have a well-defined worldview. Even if the worldview has a lot of flexibility within it, I think it's important to have something you can kind of point to. And I think this is a reason why a lot of people prefer to have a leader with a religious tradition, because you can at least know what set of standards they're pretending to hold themselves to. If they're Muslim, you can say, okay, they're at least in theory trying to hold themselves to Islamic values or to the Quran. If they're Catholic, you can at least hope that they are that's kind of the basis of how they make their decisions. So I think it's important to kind of get into this. So where does kind of my political philosophy come from? How does it develop? Is it just kind of an off-the-shelf thing? Like, am I just a traditionalist, or just alt-right, or just fascist, or something like that? Not exactly. I guess you could say I'm a bit of a special snowflake, but I think most people who are kind of honest with themselves, it goes beyond just a bit of a just kind of a category. And don't get me wrong, categories are very important, particularly for people who aren't like political philosophers or whatever, and aren't political scientists and don't run like discussion YouTube channels, to just be able to, there's this term heuristic, where it's a symbol or a word or something that contains a lot of depth to it. You know, a picture's worth 1,000 words. You see a stop sign, all these things just go through your head, like danger, there could be children passing, there could be another car coming, that kind of thing. It's a heuristic, so that's very important. But for me, it's kind of hard to just kind of necessarily define where I am, aside from just saying I am definitely on the right of the political spectrum. So I'd say my views have really kind of developed and changed over time. I've in the past considered myself to be a socialist, a conservative, a traditionalist, etc., kind of going all over the place. I think today, though, how I would kind of describe myself is, I don't know if you want to call me like a political naturalist, might be kind of an interesting way of putting it. Kind of an empiricist. I don't really know how to describe it, because kind of my modern political views developed over time from just reading a lot of history. And what I kind of found when I started reading history is there are these common universal aspects to all cultures and to all civilizations, at least all successful civilizations. And I do think there is a definition of success and the good and happiness, which once again I think you can kind of glean to a certain extent empirically. So kind of the basis of my worldview is the idea that through observation of human history, you can gain certain eternal truths, things that are always present, things that are always important, and you can kind of define what human nature is and the nature of the world is by looking at this. Now, does that mean that just because something appears in every culture that it's moral or that it's right? No, but at the same time, identifying the negative aspects of human nature are very similar to, is also a very important exercise. So maybe let's just kind of take a step back. So what would I say is kind of the goal of this? I define what I think kind of the goal of a society, or kind of the goal of the individual, is the maintenance and the betterment of that individual or that society. That is, you want to take with what you are at an essential level and you want to make it better while kind of preserving the core. Because I think to a large extent the fundamental nature of something is unchanging. The way it manifests may change. The efficiency and whether it's good or bad, because within us I think there is very much the capacity for both. There is very much the beast, the overman and beast, which are both come from the same place and both have the same characteristics. It's why foils are such an attractive thing, like the villain and the foil, who are very similar, because I think that is something very true in societies and individuals, because ultimately a society is kind of an individual in that it's kind of an overarching identity made up of a lot of small ones. But I'm getting off topic. So the maintenance and betterment of the individual. So how would I kind of define better? What is kind of the good? What is something that people should strive for? I think it's not necessarily, to a certain extent it's objective, to a certain extent it's subjective. There's a term I really like called intersubjective, which is something that's not exactly objective, but something that's common to everybody who watches it or everybody who experiences it. Like chocolate, for instance, is intersubjectively delicious because the vast majority of people like it. It's something that's generally considered pleasant. To a certain extent, movies are intersubjective or forms of entertainment because it appeals to maybe something kind of fundamental within the person. So it might not be objectively good, but it appeals to something objective. Be it chocolate, it appeals to certain common taste sensations, etc. So I kind of feel if you look at all of human history, you try to find what are the things that have generally made people happy. Not just bring pleasure to people, but fulfilled them, that have made them happy in pretty much every successful society. Every society that's been able to achieve what I think the goal is of sustaining and improving upon yourself. And so let's kind of talk about what some of these things are and kind of how I come to them. Something every society that has succeeded and kind of survived and thrived has had is the family. In a lot of ways, the family it precedes society. It's in the Catholic Church and a lot of kind of ideologies, it comes first. It's the basic unit of social organization. A lot of people would say the individual isn't, it's the family. And every successful civilization in history has had some variation of the nuclear family. There's been a mother, a father, and children. And some societies have been polygamous, but polygamous societies are almost always just for the upper class. It's not something that's necessarily widely practiced. The upper class may be polygamous, but it's not something that really translates to the rest of society, and it makes the society unstable for a number of reasons we can talk about some other time. But you do have that, I think, in every society, and it's always viewed as the good. It's good to get married. Every society has had some concept of marriage, too. And people might say, well, there's some random African tribes that never invented the wheel, where there was no concept of marriage, and everybody just kind of had sex with everybody. And to that, I'd say exactly my point. That's not a successful society. So every society has had that. Every successful society has had a concept of gender roles. Women do certain things, men do certain things. They're treated separately. I kind of do believe in the separate but equal thing, or different but equal. Men have a certain role in society. Women have a certain role in society. and they're both equally important, just in very different ways. And if you look at it throughout history, that these always are very similar throughout different societies. Women kind of have the run of the household. They kind of play the supportive role. The man is the provider, the soldier, the hunter, that kind of thing, the government. But women are the glue that holds society together. I kind of refer to it as the male is the creative and destructive force. The female is the sustaining and nurturing force. And you need both of these to run a successful society. It's not possible to say, really, to talk about one as being better than the other and one as being more important than the other is an incoherent concept. I think if you look empirically, the concept of the mother-father raising children, because it's something so universal and it's something every society developed independently from one another. Because I think, to my mind, what really kind of changed me was when I started reading about non-Western societies. Like, if we look at the Aztec Empire, now the Aztec Empire had a lot of issues. It was in many ways a very evil society, but they had a very similar concept of the nuclear family. They had very similar concept of gender roles. They had a concept of marriage that would be immediately recognizable to someone from Europe. And these civilizations had no contact. They developed completely independent from one another. China had a concept of the nuclear family and marriage. Japan did. Now you might say there's rampant promiscuity in these societies, but at a core, there was this idea of marriage that developed within societies that didn't have a ton of interaction with each other. It's something that grew out of just A, what works, B, kind of the natural desire of humanity. So that's kind of an example of it. The idea of division of labor is something we see in all societies. The idea that there's a class system, sometimes a caste system, but that all of them are important to society, kind of in I don't want to call it integralism or whatever, but that there's warriors, there's rulers, there's philosophers, there's farmers, there's soldiers. And people are predisposed towards some of these. Some people are smarter, some people are stronger. And it's good that you have all these different people in society. And the fact that not everybody can do everything is a good thing. It's something desirable. And kind of what the idea is you try to make a society in which these different interests are harmonized. And obviously that doesn't always work out. But I find that is something, a challenge that every society has struggled with, and the more successful ones are the ones who are better able to kind of square the circle and to get the different aspects of society to focus on their own thing, but to kind of contribute to a common good. And I think every society has had that. They've had a sense of hierarchy, they've had a sense of role differentiation, etc. And I guess kind of if we want to talk about, I guess, kind of some more modernist ideas, I think most successful societies will have some form of representation, particularly with regards to the more modern era. And that's kind of getting into another topic, is people like to think of me, I guess, as a traditionalist, and that's not entirely unfair, because a lot of my ideas are kind of old-fashioned or anachronistic, I guess people would say, in the modern era. At the same time, though, when we talk about this idea of things that I think are kind of eternal, it's not really a traditionalist versus modernist thing. It's just kind of a human thing, I guess you could say. Just because past society might have done better on some of these issues doesn't mean that it's inherently better. I guess you could say, just because something's older, or just because something had some aspects that were better, doesn't mean it was better on the whole. And I think this is a mistake some reactionaries make, where they overly idealize the past, and they say, well, everything was great back in the Middle Ages or something, and they ignore like the rampant famine, the rampant societal violence, the complete lack of individual rights for the common people, and a lot of them will kind of cringe when you mention the concept of rights. But it's I think you just kind of have to, when you're looking at a particular policy, etc., you have to go and say, how did this work historically? Does this make sense, etc.? And that kind of comes down to another aspect of my political philosophy, which is things do not happen by accident. Some people have this idea, I call it the natural disaster view of history, where things just kind of happen and there's no explanation for them. Like, Africa is just poor. It just happened. It's not because of the population. It's not because of natural causes or whatever. It's because of a conspiracy or something like that. Societies, I think, develop in the way they do to suit their environment. And I say this independently of morality, because a lot of things that develop are wrong and are things that shouldn't continue. But I think before you even go into questions of morality, you have to acknowledge that there's a reason these things exist. Like, something, I think one of the best examples of this is Islam. So a lot of people in these circles dislike it, and I completely understand why. But I think you have to understand, why did it develop? Why did this particular, like, a lot of it may just seem absurd to us how specific the rule set is, how restrictive things are. Like, I remember kind of, the conservative thing is, oh, why they have to wear hijabs? Is it because if they see, like, a woman's hair, they'll go crazy and rape her? And the truth is, yes, that's why they implemented it. The reason why Islam is so restrictive and so kind of totalitarian is because it was designed for a group of people with very low social trust, very high time preference, and bad impulse control. So also tribal societies in which vendettas could last centuries and turn into bloodbaths. So by imposing this extremely rigid, legalistic, disciplinary system on the Arab peoples, it suited them very well, and you can't really argue with success. The caliphate was able to expand across the world. And like I said, this developed within the context of what worked the best for the Arabs. Lots of societies kind of can have these quirky things that emerge. Like within the northwestern Europe, the idea of representation in parliament and stuff, I think, emerged, and it was more successful there than it was in a lot of other societies because they were higher trust and they had more of a culture of kind of freeholders, of kind of free peasants, of small landowners, and that was kind of contributing to this idea that people should have representation. Like, the development of modern democracy, of modern kind of republic and stuff, isn't an accident. You can think it was good or bad, you can think it was done well or not, but in my view, it was a direct response to better education, to higher overall wealth, to people having more time to pursue, I guess you could say, self-actualization and that kind of thing. And it was only natural that once people had more information, had better socioeconomic status, they would start to want a say in how their society was run. Also, the advancement of firearms made the idea of a warrior aristocracy obsolete, because you didn't need a super expensive horse and armor and all this other stuff anymore. You just needed a musket, and you could learn to use the musket in a week or two. You could be really good with it in a couple months, and you could shoot a knight. The knight who spent maybe like 20 years or whatever training, getting the best equipment money can buy, and just kind of some random pleb with a gun can shoot them down. So you had kind of the egalitarianism we see today, I think, is in a lot of cases the natural result of historical processes. And like I said, that's not to say that it was a positive development. That's not to say that it was done in the best way possible. But I think before you decide you want to change something, you have to acknowledge that, like I said, people weren't stupid. These people didn't do the things they did because they were dumb. Muhammad didn't put all this stuff in the Quran. Islam doesn't have all these regulations necessarily. I mean, there is a lot of superstitious nonsense in various cultures. But kind of, if you take a broad view, these things emerge within a response to the environment, the temperament of the people, their biological predisposition, etc. Like East Asian societies are very different because the people there are very different. The cultures there are very different. And that's kind of, I think, one of the tragedies of the modern era, was this attempt to force a one-size-fits-all thing to all societies. And that's kind of a left-right kind of divide. 'Cause if you look at, I guess, kind of like what would normally be considered a far-right ideology, like fascism, fascism varied very wildly dependent on the society, because it took a lot of aspects of the host culture. It would take, in some countries it was Catholic, in some it was Protestant, in some it was more religious, in some it was less religious, in some it was more racist, in some it was more multiracial. It depended very much on what the host culture was, because it's kind of a right-wing ideology, whereas communism is much more of a one-size-fits-all. It's a rationally constructed thing, because there's rationalism and there's empiricism. Rationalism is where you go from first principles or from an abstract idea and then apply it to specific circumstances. Empiricism in this context is you take observations and you draw generalized conclusions from those. And I like to think of myself to a certain extent as being a kind of a political empiricist. So you kind of get this, and this, I think, once again, this is regardless of how you think society should be and what policies you want. But I think whenever you're considering an action, you have to say, is this in line with human nature? Is this in line with who our society is and what our society is? And the attempt to just graft what I consider unnatural things onto society with no context is the cause of a lot of our modern issues. So at the same time, though, once again, just because something's older doesn't necessarily mean it's good. It doesn't mean it's desirable. There's a lot of good things that came about from the modern era. In some ways, people are happier because they're not dying at like 30 or whatever, with all their joints having been worn down, and from like they get a paper cut or something and the wound gets infected, or we have all these things that have made life a lot better for people. So it's not a linear thing. Change is inevitable to a certain extent. Whether you think it's a good or bad thing, progress is inevitable. It's about how you steer the progress. It's about how you deal with it. It's about, I guess, kind of trying to reconcile things. So some people, if you want to call me maybe reactionary modernist, that's probably a good idea. Because it's you can't stop time, no matter how much you might want to, or you'll be a left behind society that can't survive in the long term. Like, I think a good example of this is if we compare Japan to China. Now, Japan was very keen on embracing westernization. Emperor Meiji industrialized the country. They adopted modern weaponry, modern technology in a very short period of time. And Japan changed, but it was still very innately Japanese. The fact that it underwent all these transformations meant that when European powers started kind of really monopolizing East Asia, Japan was a great power. It could maintain its sovereignty, it could maintain its culture and its traditions. It just took a more modern technological hue. They adopted kind of more modern forms of government, whereas China did not change. And because it didn't really change and it wasn't successfully able to adopt the modern era, you wound up going through decades of civil war, accumulating in communism, which destroyed most of traditional Chinese culture. So that's kind of, I think, a case where if you're completely unwilling to try to kind of adapt to the times and to take what I consider the eternal message and to kind of project it onto how things have kind of gone. Like, the idea to me is you have to maintain what's eternal. You have to maintain what's reflective of human nature, of human happiness, of human fulfillment, of what kind of the good is, as opposed to a preference for the past or present or future. That to me is kind of an incoherent concept. It's just as bad, in my view, to idolize something because it happened in the past as to idolize something because it's the current year. So I think that's kind of the basis. So let's just kind of go into the last aspect, which I guess is religion. So how does this kind of apply to my religious beliefs? Why am I Christian, aka Catholic, etc.? Because I think Christianity, within the Christian tradition, there's this idea of whose God is it? Like, why is your God real but other gods aren't? And it's it's kind of, once again, it's an incoherent question, because there is, in terms of how we refer to God with an uppercase G, he is the creator, he is the first cause, he is the one uncaused cause. And there can't be an alternative to that. The idea of the one, whatever you want to call it, at a very basic level, in Neoplatonism, it's the one, the demiurge, the world soul, the deistic conception of the blind watchmaker, etc. These are all maybe different interpretations of what can only be one being or one force, etc. It's not like you're taking Zeus versus Thor. You're taking the core principle of existence, or the core being that radiates existence, versus another perception of that. And I do think you see that in every society, even if they do have kind of this polytheistic veneer, there is always a concept of the underlying reality. This ultimate being, this kind of wellspring from which everything else comes. And you see this in Greek philosophy, you see this in Middle Eastern philosophy, you see this in East Asian philosophy. It may not always be the most kind of obvious, or the most similar to kind of how we view it in the West, but it is always there. The idea of the afterlife, the soul, something being spiritually greater than yourself, is something that exists within all human societies. And people might say, well, there's some random tribe in the Amazon that has no concept of any of this, and they have a language of 12 words. And to that, once again, I say exactly. So you're saying, like people say, well, complex religion only developed when civilization started to develop. And so you're saying that, like, religion is a reflection of civilization and education. That doesn't really help your case. So I do think there is this, and to a certain extent I'm very sympathetic towards perennialism, because it is something you do see these recurrent spiritual trends throughout all of human civilization. And that's not to say there aren't huge differences between religion, but as a Catholic we acknowledge that people have the yearning to reconciliation with God, that God can be known through reason alone, and that people can worship God without necessarily being Christian in an imperfect way. So why Christianity then? Because I think Christianity, more than any other religion, from this perspective, ignoring kind of specific historical, or whatever you want to call it, arguments for it, it's very flexible towards systems of government. It doesn't really specify if it's a democracy, a theocracy, an autocracy, a monarchy. It's very flexible with what kind of system it has, what kind of social structure it has. And that's kind of why there's been so many different versions of it. What it does focus on, though, is these fundamental human truths. The need for reconciliation, the need for forgiveness. Within every religious tradition, there's this seeking of a union with God. There's a seeking of communion with God. And I think in the person of Jesus Christ, you can see the source of where that desire comes from. Is that we as people, we're programmed, or we have this natural inclination for the need for reconciliation. The need for kind of this bridge between the human and the divine. And I think that reflects our universal longing for Christ. And that he fulfills that better than anything else, just in a unique position. To an extent that's so kind of different from the alternatives and the other stuff that's out there, that that's kind of, to a certain extent, why, just once again, regardless of historical or other stuff, I think it does fulfill the universal human desire for reconciliation with God, the universal human desire for the divine. So I hope that kind of explains what my political perspective is. I hope you kind of understand it a little bit more. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll talk to you guys later.